What is the difference between workers and slaves? That is the question for this video. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today we are discussing the difference between workers and slaves. The difference between workers and slaves is of particular interest to left-wing thinkers who use the term wage slavery. Wage slavery is deliberately used to compare the conditions between wage labour and renting oneself, and slavery, the condition of being owned. That isn't to say that the conditions will be equal. Slavery obviously constitutes total ownership of the individual, whilst wage labour constitutes the renting of the individual within the realm of employment. That being said, there are some valuable insights we can gain from contrasting them. Wage slavery is used to show that the individual is divorced from the product of their labour by a wage. Rather than producing a product and then selling that to an employer, they instead are rented by an employer. This employer pays them a wage rather than their market price of the product of their labour. Bit of a mouthful. So what do we mean by the product of our labour? Well, the product of our labour is anything in which we do in the world that requires effort. So once we start putting work in to an object, we are starting to move that object from what it was to something that it becomes. And that movement is a direct result of human labour. An example would be planting a tree. You plant a tree by getting a seed and putting it in the ground. The two raw components, the two raw elements, the objects within this are the seed and the soil. The act of planting the seed into the soil is what changes it from two objects to a product. It turns it from the ground and the seed, which were not owned, to the tree, which is owned. So what constitutes ownership and what constitutes value? These are two vitally important questions when considering the product of the individual's labour. So first, what is ownership? And how is it that the labourer owns the product? So there are two ways to gain ownership. The first is the original way to constitute ownership, and the second has to really proceed after the first. The first is when you move an object to a product. So if you take something that exists in the world, which is naturally common property, it can be anything, right, that is not currently owned. It's anything that is, from nature or exists within the world objectively from humans. This is an object. The product is the finished result when labor has been applied to it, when labor has been mixed in it. So the apple is the product of the labourer who planted the tree that produced the apple. The labour that constitutes the growth of the apple, okay, the tree was involved. The tree has no rights of ownership because it's not sentient. But the apple itself then belongs to the person who planted the tree and grew the apple. That combination of object and labour is what produces, when we mix our labour into the objective world, we privatize it. We create something that becomes our own because we mix ourselves into it. This is what produces value. It's what takes the common field into the farmer's field, for example. The second is the marketplace. The marketplace is where commodities are traded, commodities being the products of our labour. We trade the product of our labour at market for a fair value price. So we say that X amount of labour went into the production of this product. The resource may be hard to come by, so you may need to labour on it more, you may need to put more time in to get it, so the resource is more valuable, since essentially turns back to labour again. And then we compare the effort between these two products, and we say, okay, so X amount of potatoes is worth X amount of shoes. But usually we divorce this into a monetary value, a standard value. So X amount of potatoes is worth Y amount of money, and X amount of shoes is worth Y amount of money. And then we can use that money to then buy anything within that common marketplace. Really easy. It's just the marketplace. You go there, you buy things. You've done it all before. You're consumerists. You definitely know what this is. So this is where we have the opportunity to exchange property. Now, the individual who produces property has constituted ownership. Now, this is something that is not respected by the employer. The employer instead pays the individual a wage. This wage then constitutes the compensation given to the labourer instead of the market value in which they have produced. They have been deliberately divorced from it so that they can increase profit margins. This is because if the individual understood the market value of the product which could be sold, then they would understand themselves as having that value, the value of their labour constituting a greater component within that trade that they are part of. So let's take a camera lens. The individual who assembles a camera lens has taken the components of the camera lens and turned it into a lens. Now, the value of that lens is directly resultant from the labour of the individual who created it. Now, the wage they are paid is deliberately used to divorce them from the value they began with and the value they've produced. And the reason for that is because that allows for exploitation, a greater profit margin. It alienates the individual from the product of their labour. And this is why Karl Marx says, "Let us remember that commodities possess an objective character as value only insofar as they are all expressions of identical social substance, human labour, that their objective character as values is therefore purely social. From this it follows self-evidently that it can only appear in social relation between commodity and commodity. Once you are divorced from this commodity-commodity relationship, you are at a disadvantage within the trade. You are being divorced from the value of the product, and the product being the product of your labour. Your ownership of the product is what gives you the right to compensation." Now, people might say, well, Lewis, how can the worker on the assembly line who's assembling the lens own the lens? Now, this is true. They do not own holistically the lens because other people have worked on the lens before them. The raw components in which are assembled into the lens, they've been mined, they've been treated, they've been turned into what the components are then meant to be before assembly. Each component part has had to be laboured upon within the division of labour. Each labourer is entitled to the market value of that component. So then you would take those individual components and their market value and you would minus them from the overall value that the assembler has created. So you take the camera lens, you'd minus the component parts, and then from that point, you would see a difference in value. That difference in value is what the individual is entitled to when they labour. When they work, you're entitled to the product of your labour. That is the value you've created. And when you're divorced from that, you can be exploited. So that is important to remember. So people might even say to us like, Lewis, well, surely this value wouldn't be very much. I mean, if you think about it, maybe we're actually compensating people's wages because such labour can be so low skilled that it doesn't produce that much value. You could replace anyone on the factory line with anyone else. Well, this is true. All that means is that the individual who does the job, regardless of who they are worth the same amount. And the amount they are worth is the product of their labour, as I've said. Now, that is actually the greatest component within value. If you look at how much the components of a camera lens are worth before they're assembled, it's considerably less than what the lens was worth, just as how much the quartz was worth before it was turned into glass. These objects are worth very little compared to the product, and that is because it is use. It is human labour that produces use value, that produces something that can be used and exchanged in market that people want to buy. Locke says this really well when he says, "Nor is it so strange as perhaps before consideration it may appear that the property of labour should be able to overbalance the community of land, for it is labour indeed that puts the difference of value on everything. And let anyone consider that the difference between an acre of land planted with tobacco or sugar, sown with wheat or barley, and an acre of the same land lying in common without any husbandry upon it, and he will find the improvement of labour makes the far greater part of the value. So what he shows is that an acre of common land is almost worthless compared to the acre of land which has had husbandry upon it, that has been planted and grown and tended to become the crops that can be then sold at market. So as you can see, labour constitutes ownership over the product. The product's value is then the market value it can be given. It could be bought for and exchanged for commodity, and this is what the labourer is entitled to. So people might still be a bit confused at why we would compare this to slavery, and the reason why we compare this to slavery is because it's a breach of one's liberty. They have taken from you your proprietorial rights. They have taken from you your natural rights as a human to own the product of your labour. Your labour is being demanded from you at an unfair and unjust price. Humboldt puts this really well when he says, "Man never regards what he possesses as so much his own as what he does, and the labourer who tends a garden is perhaps in a truer sense its owner than the listless voluptuary who enjoys its fruits." In view of this consideration, it seems as if all peasants and craftsmen might be elevated into artists, that is, men who love their labour for its own sake, improve it by their own plastic genius and inventive skill, and thereby cultivate their intellect, ennoble their character, and exalt and refine their pleasures. And so humanity would be ennobled by the very things which now, though beautiful in themselves, often serve to degrade it. But still, freedom is undoubtedly the indispensable condition without which even the pursuits most congenial to the individual human nature can never succeed in producing such salutary influences. Whatever does not spring from a man's free choice or is only the result of instruction and guidance does not enter into his very being, but remains alien to his true nature. He does not perform it with truly human energies, but merely with mechanical exactness. So as you can see, we are divorced from ourselves. We are placed in a dehumanizing condition. We are being complicit in our own dehumanization because of coercion. We are unable to choose a livelihood which allows us to express ourselves. It prevents us from feeling the satisfaction in which we would feel from truly unexploited labor, from true ownership of the product of our labor. So you may ask, why do we give ourselves over to this? And there's a really good quote by Simon Linguet. I think that's how you say it. I'm English. Linguet? Linguet? I want to say Linguet, but I don't think it's Linguet. So he's French. Please let us off. Right. And he says that we give ourselves over to this wage slavery because it is the impossibility of living by any other means that compels our farm labourers to till the soil whose fruits they will not eat, and our masons to construct buildings in which they will not live. It is want that drags them to those markets where they await masters who will do them the kindness of buying them. It is want that compels them to go down on their knees to the rich man in order to get from him permission to enrich him. What effective gain has the suppression of slavery brought him? He is free, you say. Ah, that is his misfortune. The slave was precious to his master because of money he had cost him, but the handicraftsman costs nothing to the rich voluptuary who employs him. These men, it is said, have no master. They have one and the most terrible, the most imperious of masters, that is need. It is this that reduces them to the most cruel dependence. So yeah, there are people who will still find satisfaction within employment. It doesn't justify their alienation and the dehumanizing characteristics it places upon them. It is actually changing their being, their character, and prevents them from experiencing freedom, and in many cases even prevents them from wanting it. To have the responsibility to engage within the trade is something that people aren't accustomed to, but it's a responsibility that frees you not only from the exploitation of the other individual, but frees you from your own ignorance and lets you become part of an objective common world. So you may ask, how can we free ourselves from this wage slavery? Now, we can free ourselves from by the free association of labour, by understanding labour as creating a product and an ownership, but also this ownership has to go beyond the individual product that one creates and instead is intrinsic to the whole mechanism in which owns the process. You own your labour. When you are employed to labour, you are being alienated from it. So you need to own the whole mechanism. You need to be part of a democratic institution. And that democratic institution would be a workers' cooperative, for example, in which all the workers own the business. Now, I'm not saying that we'll have to take businesses without compensation. I think Nozick puts it really well when he says that, you have to compensate people for their property. And if an individual's property constitutes what they've laboured upon, then the business owners and their labour should be taken into consideration as equally as those workers. So they should be paid for their labour that has produced the value of the corporation. That value is something that would have to decide democratically, and is something that I could never, put a market price on, because the market is a democratic environment. So it's through these free associations of labour that we will be given freedom. However, people may still want to work in employment in our society. They may see this as maybe an increased responsibility. They may see this as difficult, foreign, and something that they do not want to enter in. And that's a matter of education. We need to educate people on the value of freedom and their own liberty, because people who have not experienced freedom do not understand the value of it. People who have not truly engaged in freedom do not understand how to be free, and to use these arguments to perpetuate our bondage cannot be justified, because we need to slowly degrade the system which bonds us, to give people the responsibility piece by piece to allow them to adjust to what is their own freedom that they have been alienated from. I would like to end on a quote by Rousseau, which really shows that this process is more difficult than we can even perceive in day-to-day life. It's something that goes beyond the institutions we talk about and delves into the ideological stances of those that exist within them. It's something that is ideologically prescribed and hegemonically carried out in the actions of those who are employed and those who exist within our society. It's something that is embedded within our being. And that is why Rousseau says, if they are slaves by nature, that is because they have been slaves against nature. Force made the first slaves, and by degrading and corrupting its victims, perpetuated their bondage. So to free ourselves, we have to begin with education, and we have to begin with educating all of our population. And that doesn't mean by teaching them, by forcing knowledge upon them. It means by getting them to critically engage with the subject area that they are the owners of the product of their labour. So I hope you've all enjoyed this video. If you like it, give it a thumbs up. And as always, try to gain some perspective.